Hello everybody, welcome back to Anglo Election Insights, where I'm coming out with a new video today because it's very rainy in the Northern Rivers today and it's very much an inside day. So the purpose of today's video is going to be to examine the state vote intention polls, or at least the information that we have, because obviously at a time like now it's a lot sparser than the federal vote intention polls, and we'll compare them to the state breakdowns of federal vote intention and see if there's sort of a connection between the performance of state governments and their oppositions, and whether or not that might have some sort of like coattails effect on the federal Labor government, or if it's going to hurt them, as perhaps will be the case in Victoria. So we'll jump into the video. Now, as a caveat, I'm well aware that Australian voters have a history of being fairly sort of well-informed in terms of what the role of the federal government is and what they are voting for in terms of federal elections, and then separating that from the state governments. So Australians don't just kind of blindly follow a party brand. They understand the difference between federal and state governments, and we can see the results of elections such as 2010 in Victoria at both the state and federal level, or perhaps 2019 federally in Queensland compared to their state election in 2020. There's quite a large divergence, and there's numerous other examples over the course of history. So I am aware of that. But then we do see examples such as WA in 2021 and 2022, where Labor probably benefited federally from the strength of the party brand at the state level. We'll see over the course of the video that coalition governments, particularly in Queensland, seem to be quite popular, and of course the brand is very much popular in the Northern Territory, going by their recent election, but maybe not so much in Tasmania, while for Labor, their state governments remain popular in both WA and South Australia, but very much not the case in Victoria, and perhaps maybe not the case in New South Wales, although some recent polling is suggesting that might not be so much the case. So we'll just jump right into where we're at state by state. So I'm going to begin with New South Wales. So this latest Demos AU poll has the state Labor government out to a 4% lead on two-party preferred, which is more or less where they were, maybe slightly better than where they were at the 2023 state election. But it's interesting because over the course of this term, their polling definitely hasn't been that kind to them, despite being a new Labor government after sort of 12 years of a coalition government at the state level. And we can see here on Resolve that as you go back, they don't have two-party preferred figures here, but we can see, the Labor primary sort of struggling and stalling out in the early 30s, and then in the latest reading at the end of February, really sort of crashing below the 30s there, while the coalition's holding steady up in the high 30s, but then Demos AU finding quite a different result in what I believe is their first state poll for New South Wales. And then if we go to what's happening federally, we can see that at the same time they are finding a 1% lead to the coalition. So we've got a 5% difference there between their polling at the state and federal level. If we were to move over to Victoria, so this is where it gets quite interesting. So the latest Demos AU poll has the coalition pulling ahead. So we have the Labor's primary vote crashing nearly 12% from the 2022 result. Brad Batten opening up a big lead as preferred premier from nowhere. In fact, I don't think there's been a personal ratings poll where Brad Batten hasn't actually led as preferred premier. But if that's not true, I'm sure someone will point it out. And we can see that the final figure here, if I can find it, it's Here it is. So a 2% lead to the coalition on two-party preferred at the state level. And if we look at some of the other sort of recent results, Redbridge back in February, I think this one was, or might have been the start of March, they have the coalition just pulling ahead by 1%, and Resolve Political Monitor has been very unkind to Labor. There was the diabolical 22% ALP primary at the end of January, and then the most recent reading just a week or so ago only shows a slight improvement, and we can see here, really the coalition jumping out to a pretty big lead there, although the high Greens vote is meaning that the two-party preferred reading isn't blowing out in the coalition's favour just yet. And if we look at how that has sort of shaken out in terms of federally, we're looking at a 49-51 two-party preferred, so that is a very slight lead to Labor, and a couple of the other polling units have found a similar thing. If I go to here, so Newspoll also had Labor enjoying a 1% lead in Victoria on federal vote intention, and Freshwater Strategy had the exact same result. So clearly there's something going on in terms of state Labor and federal Labor both suffering, and perhaps my contention is that maybe a project like the suburban rail loop could actually be influencing this, given that the project is pretty much relying on federal funding at this point. I do wonder if the fact that federal Labor has committed finally the $2 billion that it needs to sort of get its first stage off the ground, whereas the coalition has actually promised to pull that funding. So I do wonder if maybe the federal coalition are going to be able to leverage that issue even more, and state Labor's woes in terms of Victoria might actually prove somewhat decisive in terms of federal Labor's chances. Although whether it's going to be enough to flip a seat like Hawke or Holt or Crankamart or Dunkley or even Bruce, that remains to be seen. But it could be enough to flip the three main marginals of Chisholm, Aston and McEwen. We will keep moving. So we haven't had a whole lot of data out of Queensland. The state result ended up being about 54-46 to the coalition, and Redbridge has come out with the first state poll since last October's election, and we've got a 6.5% lead with the LNP's primary up on 44%, and David Crisafulli's personal ratings well ahead of Stephen Miles. Looking at those figures, a favourability, what is that, like a net 29%, something like that, whereas Stephen Miles appears to be underwater by about 13%, so that's a huge gap in personal ratings. And then just chugging back here to Poll Bludger, so for a long time and still according to their sort of state breakdown, it's showing very little movement to the coalition despite a nearly 2% swing to them nationally. And there is a thought that perhaps Labor can be a bit overstated in the polls in Queensland, and maybe there was slight evidence of that in the lead up to the Queensland state election, where the state Labor government got within like 2 points right on election eve, but that might have also had something to do with the change from early vote to election day vote. But also in 2019 and even 2022 federally, there were polling misses that favoured Labor. But what was interesting was in these recent Newspoll and Freshwater Strategy quarterly breakdowns, the coalition got their lead from sort of 3-4%, which would be a status quo result, from the last federal election all the way out to a 7% lead, which would be a swing of like 3-ish%. And in freshwater, they had it at 54. So very much kind of, in terms of news poll at least, that movement reflecting what's happened at the state level, whether or not the federal coalition will actually benefit from the newfound popularity of the Crisafulli government remains to be seen, but it is interesting that that movement has occurred. So then we'll continue moving through the states. So up to WA, of course, we had the one poll that matters, that is the state election. You can see here the two-party preferred figure was basically a 7-point win for Labor. And if we have a look at Demos AU, I think I keep referring to them because they put out these great polls that combine the state and federal vote intention. This was conducted just before the state election, which was at the end of March, and I think they actually found 57-43 to Labor, which they're having a bit of a brag here that they correctly predicted it. Good job, guys. So in that same poll, they had federal Labor only leading by 2 points, which would represent about a 3-ish% swing from 2022. And there might be a bit of an issue around the live sheep export ban that was implemented by federal Labor. So perhaps there is like the potential for a slight softening of Labor support in WA, but at the same time, going back to these quarterly breakdowns, we don't see it at all in either news poll, which is showing a very small swing to the coalition from last time, or Freshwater Strategy, which is showing a swing of 1% to Labor based on their state breakdowns. So maybe this news from Demos AU is in fact old news. It'd be interesting to see if they poll the state of WA before the election. We'll keep going. So in South Australia, again, we have a popular state Labor government going from strength to strength, and the Liberals absolutely floundering. So the Labor's lead is out to 9%, which, that's massive. That's landslide territory, even more so than in WA. And we don't really have any other sort of data out of SA in terms of state voting intention, but interestingly, at the federal level, it's not really being repeated at all. In fact, Bludger Track is now showing a 1.5% swing to the coalition from 2022's federal election. And one thing to keep in mind with Bludger Track is that he's still using the 2022 preference flows, whereas a lot of other pollsters have tweaked them to be a little bit more favourable to the coalition, more like a sort of a 2019 result. And in South Australia, you've got this high One Nation vote. You can see here 8.5% on Bludger Track, and if we go down and have a look at the federal findings here, only 6% there, but like generally there has been a finding that One Nation is polling a little bit better in South Australia. So if their preferences flow more like sort of 70-30 rather than like 55-45 or whatever it was in 2022, that could be quite decisive in terms of the final two-party preferred measure in South Australia. We'll just have a quick look at the other states as well, or the states and territories remaining. So in Tassie, we really just have this one pollster, EMRS, who put out like a month, I think it's a quarterly vote intention poll, and it looks as if here's the election result. Looks like it's tightened just a little bit. So I don't think they produce a two-party preferred measure, but it looks to me as if Labor might even have their nose in front. Just on that last reading in February, but very limited data points. It doesn't look to me as if there's been a collapse in Liberal support at the state level, but certainly that government is tiring and not really making up much ground, and the personal ratings reflect that as well. Rockcliffe is just sort of going nowhere. But Dean Winter, the new leader, hasn't really made up much ground from where Rebecca White was, interestingly enough. And then, of course, at the federal level, the polling firms never really get enough of a sample from Tasmania to actually compile it into something useful. But interestingly, Albanese he appears to be trying to create a bit of a battleground out of Tasmania, endorsing Rebecca White in Lyons to try and hold that seat, and also, targeting the seat of Braddon with another high-profile candidate, as well as that salmon farming policy or that exemption from the environmental law or whatever it was. So, maybe Labor is seeing something in their polling that suggests that, maybe Tasmania is a little bit more competitive for Labor in terms of the two Liberal-held seats, and they've got a really good chance in Lyons compared to what we're seeing publicly. I know that in the YouGov MRPs and in the Redbridge MRPs, the general consensus was that the two Liberal-held seats are safe and that Lyons was very likely to fall to the Liberals. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that. Finally, in the Northern Territory, we get basically nothing in terms of polling from the Northern Territory. But one poll we did get, and this was in, I think, mid-2023, a pretty decent poll in the end compared to the final result in the Northern Territory election, which was about like an 8 or 9% two-party preferred win for the coalition. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I should really check. Anyway, but a big gap in terms of primary vote, like a nearly 20% gap between the country Liberals and Labor. And interestingly enough, when they polled for federal vote intention at that point, we see not as big a gap, but still federal Labor very much in the dumps. So clearly a big lag on federal Labor. Whether or not that was due to the ailing state government at the time, hard to tell. This was conducted, I think, before The Voice lost, and before Labor lost their lead in the polls sort of over the course of 2024. But perhaps their vote, perhaps with a CLP government now in power in the NT and federal Labor showing signs of resurgence in this last month, perhaps that figure is very outdated. But it's just interesting to point out that when that poll, which turned out to be fairly accurate, was taken, that both federal and state Labor was very much on the nose. Cool. So thanks, guys. I hope that has given you, just something to think about in terms of how the state governments are going and what impact that could have on federal politics, just coming up to this election. And if you enjoyed the video, please like it. Please comment with your thoughts as well. And if you're enjoying the content and you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and do that as well. And I will be back home by the start of next week and should be able to get some more videos out, looking at the latest polling. And yeah, there should be heaps to talk about over the course of the next month. So thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you soon.